So I'll kick things off. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jess Delfiaco. I'm the communications manager for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get into things. As you were probably notified, that we are recording this seminar. It'll be posted on our YouTube channel, so please keep yourself muted during Hugh's presentation and go off camera if you so choose. We'll have some time for questions at the end when you're welcome to come on and ask your questions or go on video if you would like to do that. A little context about who we are here at the Midwest CASC and what we do if this is the first seminar you've joined. The Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or the CASC as we call it, is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and a consortium of 9 institutions in our region, which you can see on that map there. It's hosted here at the University of Minnesota, which is where I am based. We are a national network, or we're part of a national network of these regional CASCs. We all share a mission to produce science to help inform management efforts to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate, as well as respond to region-specific climate needs. Among the ways that we go about that mission are, of course, through the CASC, the USGS funds climate adaptation research projects, and we work to support those projects and partnerships. We host capacity building workshops, professional development opportunities, and other events. I'll talk about one of those on our next slide. We support a network of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers and connect them to learning and mentorship opportunities, as well as many other things. You can go to our website and check us out and learn more. Welcome to anybody who's new. For anybody who comes to these every month, thank you for listening to that spiel once more. And as I said, we have events sometimes, and our biggest one happens in August every year. We are going to be opening registration for that very soon. It's called the Summer Science Symposium. It's going to be August 3rd through the 6th. All of our community members, which includes anybody on this call today, is welcome and encouraged to join us there. It's going to be here at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. You can check our website or stay tuned on our newsletter to get more information about that. Again, that'll be coming out very soon, and I hope to see you all there. With that, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Alyssa.
Thanks, Jess. Again, welcome to everyone who's joining us today. My name is Alyssa Welch. I'm the program manager on the consortium side for the Midwest CASC, also based at University of Minnesota. I'm delighted today to welcome Hugh Ratcliffe as our speaker for our science seminar today. Hugh is an ORISE fellow with USGS, also a Climate Adaptation Associate. He's an ecologist whose broad areas of interest include the intersection of climate change and conservation, invasive species, adaptation, assisted migration, and wildlife management. And we're excited to hear from Hugh today how all of those areas of interest go into this project that he's been working on and share those details with us. So Hugh, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay. How's that looking for people?
Looks good.
Yep.
Great. Okay, yeah. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to get a chance to talk about what's been a long project that's finally wrapping up. And so today I'll be talking about work that we've been doing here at the CASC to provide a resource for states to help them incorporate climate change into their swaps. So just a quick bit of background or agenda. First, I'll go over some background and methods for the project, climate stressor summaries, then we'll really dive into the meat of impacts by habitat, and then wrap up with some cross-cutting findings and questions. So swaps, what are they? State wildlife action plans are essentially the blueprint for conservation actions for states. These plans, which come out roughly every 10 years, or every 10 years, are in them, states are required to include 8 overarching elements, ranging from identifying species of greatest conservation need, describing the condition of natural habitats, and identifying threats to species and conservation actions. What they're not required to do is consider the impact of climate change. And that's not to say they don't. In 2015, states in the Midwest did incorporate climate change, whether that was thinking about doing species climate change vulnerability index scores or more of a descriptive qualitative overview of climate impacts. But I think folks from every state would readily admit there's a lot more that they would like to do in terms of factoring in climate change into the swaps. It's just that barriers to doing this are really what you might expect. States have limited resources, and swaps are already huge lifts. And climate adaptation really is still a very nascent scientific field. Things are developing quickly. There's new climate projections and tools, and it's really hard to stay on top of things. And that knowledge need is really the basis of what this project was conceptualized out of. So in early 2023, we met with states to dig into some of these challenges and think about how we at the Midwest CASC could help states integrate climate change into their swaps. And we ended up coming up with these project objectives. The first is to provide an up-to-date overview of relevant climate stressors, trends, and projected changes. And then the second really main objective was to conduct a broad literature review and synthesis of direct and indirect climate change impacts to habitats and their key dominant species. So out of this, we've produced 7 peer-reviewed chapters, 5 are published online already, and it's all part of a broader report series. So this is obviously a pretty gargantuan task. So I first went about thinking about how to frame the geographic scale of the project. Habitats span broad swaths of the Midwest and are very disparately spaced in the landscape, while climate patterns, on the other hand, are obviously not like this. They vary from region to region and are continuous. So to frame and focus the review of climate projections, I used EPA ecoregions, a combination of level 2 and level 3, which is what you see here. And in the Midwest, there are 12 broadly defined ecoregions, which served as the area boundaries for summarizing climate trends. But given the habitat focus of this project, we needed a different habitat level scale to do our actual analysis. So states classify habitats differently, and I needed to make a product that was functional for all of them. Thankfully, a large spatial habitat classification dataset exists called the U.S. National Vegetation Classification, which I'll just call USNVC. And what the USNVC does is systematically and hierarchically classify habitats for the entire US and then map them across the country. So I used USNVC as the habitat decider, focusing on the most refined hierarchical layer that was mapped, which was the group layer. So across the 8 Midwest states, there are 77 unique groups, which I'll just call habitats from here on out. And earlier I mentioned how these habitats are disparately spread across potentially very broad areas. And on the right, here's an example of one of those habitats, the central tallgrass prairie. And clearly 77 habitats is a lot to think about climate impacts for myself and all the people helping me out. So we narrowed this down by asking states which habitats in the ecoregions that exist in their state they would most like to get a better sense of in terms of climate vulnerability. In the end, this process resulted in 22 habitats that we focused the reports on, which make up about 29% of all the unique habitats in the Midwest and cover roughly 65% of the natural habitat area in the Midwest. So this is still a very wide focus. We're still covering a lot of the Midwest and a pretty good variety of the habitats that exist within it. Initially, the plan was to write a chapter for each ecoregion and the habitats they were prioritized within. But then when I started writing, it became apparent that it would make sense to group habitats by their similarity, because a lot of the information that exists for climate change impacts to habitats is still relatively broad. Of course, not all of it, but by and large, it made sense to kind of group like habitats together. So after grouping the 22 habitats, which I did by using the higher level tiers of the USNBC hierarchy, I ended up with 7 distinct habitat types, which are shown here from different flooded and swamp forest, fens and bogs, etc. So for today, I'm mostly going to be focusing on information at this level, but I invite you to read the reports if you're hungry for more details. And here's how the individual habitats map to the chapters. There's 22, so I'm not going to read them all. But this is an overview of which habitats are in what chapter. And before I dive into the reports, I just want to mention that we also included brief climate impact summaries for focal wildlife species with 1 wildlife species per habitat. And these were included not only as a standalone resources for specific species, but also to serve as case studies for how wildlife climate vulnerability relates to impacts at the habitat level. And there was a pretty good diversity of types of wildlife species. Also, you may have noticed a bit of a terrestrial bias in what we're doing. So to balance this out a bit, we included climate impact summaries for 12 focal aquatic systems throughout the Midwest with 1 per ecoregion. So again, you can check out the reports if you're curious about what these look like. And now we can dive into the reports themselves. So a large part of this project, which really comprised the first objective, revolved around identifying which climate stressors were most relevant to focus on for each habitat. Climate change is complex, and it's not just temperature and precipitation. There are many different ways within precipitation and temperature changes that climate change acts as a stressor upon environments. While reviewing the literature for these habitats, I started off with climate stressors in mind and then used the information as I was going to then focus on 2 climate stressors per habitat, which seem to be the most important. Obviously, there are instances where just thinking about 2 may not be fully sufficient, but I think what we wanted to do was really focus on the most important aspects of climate change for these habitats and really get us started in terms of thinking about potential habitats or potential impacts. So across the 7 chapters, these were the climate stressors considered. The first is warming and heat waves, and in general, temperature increases, which go beyond thinking about just mean temperatures. So maybe that's summer temperatures, maybe that's thinking more broadly about heat stress or the number of warm days. Second was milder or shorter winter conditions. This stressor entails a variety of changes, including thinking about snowpack, seasonal timing, or minimum temperatures, but they all really relate to the broader pattern of winters in the Midwest becoming less severe. Drought is another big one, and it's related to both temperature and precipitation. And for these natural plant habitats is a very common key element when thinking about climate change. Related to that is fire. Fire is not itself a climate stressor, but the likelihood of fire occurring and severity of fire is often a product of precipitation and temperature patterns. And then lastly, we have flooding, which relates to changing patterns of precipitation, more specifically increasing precipitation in short time windows. So with that, let's dive into some quick summaries of climate projections for these stressors. Just real quick, I want to give everyone a little bit of lay of the land in terms of the broad patterns of climate change across the Midwest. Unsurprisingly, the Midwest is expected to get warmer with an average increase of 6 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, depending on climate model. I'm mostly going to be talking about RCP 8.5 instead of RCP 4.5, just, but there are tables in the reports which kind of will vary depending on the climate scenario. Projections for precipitation are a bit more complicated with a fair amount of variation between the models. Looking at just summer precipitation, summers may get drier or wetter depending on the model, while an average of all 20 climate models suggests drier summers. And more broadly, projections indicate that precipitation will likely become seasonally stratified, with drier summers and wetter falls, for example, and that precipitation may become more variable with longer dry periods and heavier rainfall events. Earlier, we covered how the Midwest is likely going to get warmer on average. And another related climate trend is that warm spells and heat waves will likely become more frequent and severe. I think this figure here is a useful way of visualizing how heat stress is likely going to be impacting plants. Here you see projected plant heat tolerance zones for the end of the century. Um, and heat tolerance zones is categorized as the number of days exceeding 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is broadly considered an important temperature threshold for plant physiology. And you can see across the Midwest for various models that the heat tolerance zone in this region is going to increase, meaning it's going to become, heat stress is going to become more severe. Conversely, winters will likely become less severe, including warmer average temperatures, less severe minimums, and shorter winter conditions. So, meaning earlier springs, longer growing seasons, and later falls. Related to this, snow depth and the length of persistence of snowpack will likely decrease. This is due to a number of reasons, such as earlier snowmelt, generally warmer temperatures, and also changing precipitation types, with precipitation increasingly likely to fall as rain rather than snow. There is, of course, variability across the region in some of the areas of the Midwest, which are highly exposed to lake effect snowfall that may initially increase, so there might be more snow. For these systems, these changes also represent more frequent freeze-thaw cycles. And we'll talk about this a bit more later, but one of the things that's interesting about changing winter severity or milder winters is that while winter conditions will likely get warmer overall, winter stress faced by organisms may actually increase in some ways. For example, freeze-thaw cycles are stressful to plants, and snowpack often acts as a insulating layer for the understory. So a loss of that insulating layer can actually increase freeze and frost risk for some species. Next, we have drought. I mentioned how precipitation projections for the Midwest have some uncertainty between the models, and the same is true for drought, except that because drought is tightly connected to warming temperatures, specifically through evaporation and vapor pressure deficit, as well as the timing of precipitation, it's likely that drought severity and frequency will increase through the century, even if conditions are wetter overall. This figure here is a little complicated. It's showing a drought index called the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, which takes into account precipitation, warming, and a few other factors. And really what this figure is showing is the frequency of extremely dry months over a 30-year period, and that extremely dry months, which are defined relative to historical baseline, are likely going to become much more frequent over the coming century. This isn't a perfect drought proxy, but there are many different ways of defining drought. But I think this tells the broader story of how we expect drought patterns to change due to climate change. For fire, we expect that the types of conditions suitable for fire will become more frequent. Of course, fire is heavily controlled in a lot of areas in the Midwest, but generally the likelihood of fire occurring is anticipated to increase. And this pattern will likely be driven by several factors, such as warmer winters and wetter springs, which can amplify fuel production, whereas hotter, drier summers can enhance fuel drying and flammability, both of which can contribute to increasing fire risk. Last, we have flooding projections, which show that flooding magnitude and frequency will likely increase, and that flow patterns will change seasonally. This includes earlier peak flows in early spring, late winter, as snowpack is reduced and snowmelt occurs earlier. and potentially lower minimum flows during summer months due to drought and changing precipitation patterns. Flooding intensity might also increase in part due to more frequent heavy precipitation events as well. So now that we have a broad understanding of some of the climate trends for the Midwest, I want to give some high-level summaries of potential impacts to the habitats I considered. So starting off with the first chapter, which is for the temperate flooded and swamp forest habitat type. There were 5 habitats included in this chapter, ranging from bald cypress floodplain forests in southern Missouri to the really expansive Midwest floodplain forest habitat. And for this set of habitats, the key stressors that we focused on were flooding and drought. So going through some of the really high level findings of how the literature is discussing impacts to these systems based on these stressors. For flooding, one of the results of future flooding dynamics is that we expect these habitats to become increasingly dynamic. Flooding plays a very strong role. It's a common disturbance in floodplain forest ecosystems. And then as flooding becomes more severe and more frequent, the habitat implications are likely to be magnified, and the rate of change in these systems will likely accelerate. For the community composition, generally this will mean that species that have higher flood tolerance will be selected for, and whereas those like several oak species will, in contrast, be negatively impacted. And then this will be a common element between all of the habitat types, but flooding will likely exacerbate invasive species and pathogen stress for many of the species there. For example, flooding can promote invasive species spread by facilitating dispersal, and flooding can also spread some pathogens and generally weaken tree resistance to pathogens and other pests, particularly for oaks. In terms of drought for these habitats, we can expect increasing physiological and regeneration stress. So high summer drying increases mortality and regeneration failure. And these losses can simplify forest structure, leading to more uniform age and size classes, and along with flooding, generally leading to more open floodplain forest habitats as gaps in the canopy are increasing. Similar to flooding, we have shifts towards species that are tolerant of drought. So given that flood drought cycles are likely going to accelerate, species that can tolerate both wet and dry conditions, such as swamp white oak, might have an advantage over species that are only tolerant for maybe one stressor, or that's their specialty. We also can expect there to be some altered soil and microbial processes. More frequent flooding drought cycles may alter biogeochemical, microbial decomposition. So for wetland plants, really thinking about that alkaline swamp where microbial processes play an outsized role, I would say, in determining community function, community composition, that will likely have pretty large effects. And then increased fire and invasion risk is also likely in terms of the implications of drought. So summer drying lowers water tables and increasing flammability, which really for the swamp forest. And canopy gaps and reduced community resistance can allow upland species to encroach. I'm just going to show one of these, and I'm not going to go through this. I just want to highlight the type of habitat-specific information that's included in these reports. So talk about the stressors and the impacts and then the affected species. The USNBC data set identifies dominant keystone species for each habitat, which really served as the focus for my literature search. And I tried to relate how individual species are likely going to be impacted by these stressors, as well as to get a sense of the variation in evidence that's out there. So some species, there's evidence for both sides of the coin for some species. Moving on. Yeah, we're doing okay on time. Next habitat is the Appalachian Interior Northeast Mesic Forest. For this one, there were three habitats that we talked about: the North Central Beech Maple Basswood Forest, the Appalachian Northeast Mesic Forest, and the Appalachian Central Interior Mesic Forest. So really, some that are located in Ohio and the southeast portion of the Midwest, and then the really broad and expansive Central Beach one. Oh, also, I haven't described the highlighting here. The highlight is where the habitats occur in the ecoregion that is being focused on. But for our purposes, this is just showing the distribution of these habitats in the Midwest. The key climate stressors we focused on for this habitat were drought and mild winters. So in terms of drought, some of the impacts that we can expect is that drought will likely influence canopy composition and drive some aspects of regeneration failure. So drought can increase mortality for species and regeneration failure, particularly for drought intolerant species like eastern hemlock, which are already under threat from hemlock woolly adelgid. Also, drought can negatively impact productivity and may accelerate canopy turnover or compositional turnover. Another key component of drought, and really the secondary effect of drought, is these tend to be densely canopied systems with cool understories. So a loss of canopy cover can actually result in a loss of thermal buffering for understory plants. So as canopy gaps increase, some of the temperature stress faced by understory species can also increase. Granted, this also opens up light, so it's a complicated process. Also, droughts increase the likelihood for fire, and consequently, fire can result in community change. More frequent severe fires can favor fire-adapted species, potentially reinforcing long-term shifts in dominance. And then, similar for all these habitats, these climate stressors really compound stresses from pests and pathogens. Drought, in particular, weakens and fire weaken trees, and can increase the outbreak potential of insects and pests. For example, the emerald ash borer, the red oak borer, which can further amplify mortality trends in these systems. For mild winters, I mentioned how declining snowpack can actually increase thermal or cold stress for saplings, seeds, and other species really growing at the understory. And this increased cold exposure can drive issues with regeneration and intensify frost damage, and that can have a disparate impact on cold sensitive species like white ash or basswood. Mild winters and early springs also influence species phenology. So when species are leafing out, when they're flowering, and species that are unable to adjust their timing risk regeneration failure or reduce competitiveness, as some plants respond more quickly and take advantage of access to light and space. Also, it increases the likelihood of mismatches between understory plants and canopy leaf out. There are some understory wildflowers, for example, that will emerge and then bloom quickly in the spring before the canopy is fully leafed out to take advantage of that. And there's some evidence that they may be responding slower than the canopy trees, so the canopy trees may be shading them out sooner. Also, another complicated element of this is that Some conifers and other trees require winter chilling, so they need a specific number of cold days in the winter to trigger the growth in the preceding spring season. So for species that require that, if cold temperatures are decreasing and they're not hitting their chilling day requirement, they can actually leaf out later in the season, despite it being warmer. And then similarly, mild winters can increase invasion, pest, and pathogen pressure. So for some species like Japanese barberry and kudzu, which are typically limited by cold stress, warmer winters may facilitate the northward expansion of those species, which is, if anyone's paid, seen kudzu, that's not good. And then mild winters are likely to increase the overwinter survival of pests and pathogens, which are typically limited by some of these extreme cold conditions. And examples include beech bark disease, forest tent caterpillar, and these declining cold extremes can facilitate further expansion of species like the spongy moth, and really importantly for some of these systems that have eastern hemlock, the hemlock woolly adelgid, which has already decimated large swaths of eastern hemlock forests in the Northeast. Moving right along, we have the North American bog and fen habitat group. We have two habitats that we discussed in this one. The first is the Midwest prairie alkaline fen, and then the other is the Eastern North American boreal, subboreal bog, and acidic fen. I wish people named these a little different. Maybe they're all a mouthful, but so for the key climate stressors that we focused on for these, first was drought, and really thinking about drought in terms of water deficits for these systems that have very specific moisture requirements, and then also warming. Thinking about drought, some of the potential impacts include peat drying and structural change. So as water deficits increase in terms of intensity or frequency, water tables lower in these systems, particularly for bogs. Groundwater fed systems are more resilient to this. And then as the water table lowers, that can accelerate decomposition, peat compaction, and also amplify fire risk. And then also drying and fire can increase acidity, which can increase nutrient release, carbon loss, and may disrupt some of the conditions that sustain fens and bogs, particularly these being relatively nutrient poor systems. And then any nutrient release could have large implications for the types of species that are able to grow there. Drought may also facilitate the decline of some fen specialists. So drought reduces productivity for shallow-rooted mosses and sedges, and can weaken species which tend to be adapted to persistent saturation. Then as some of these moisture-dependent species like sphagnum mosses decline, some of the more drought-tolerant hummock species can increase, including more upland species as well if drought conditions and water table declines last long enough. Some shrubs and various trees can have access to deeper moisture and move into these systems. And that's going to be particularly likely along some of the drier margins, driving some long-term shifts in community composition at these habitat margins. And then with drying and nutrient enrichment comes the increased risk of species invasion as these systems become more nutrient rich. Invasive species like reed canary gas, glossy buckthorn, etc., are more likely to establish and begin to dominate. Bogs and fens are strongly dependent on the microbial processes that slowly decompose peat layers, and then so any change in warming can have large impacts on some of these microbial species. Warming can also generally push peatlands towards drier states, which may result in long-term ecological transitions. Warming similarly increases nutrient availability and extends growing seasons, and which may be particularly benefit certain vascular plants, not, for example, not bryophyte, sphagnum mosses, and then vascular plants which require more nutrient conditions. Warming also can increase invasion pressure, similarly to drought in terms of thinking about nutrient availability. And then one of the key issues with a lot of invasive species is their ability to transform the landscape and facilitate further invasion. So some invaders can reinforce drying by drawing down water tables even lower through transpiration, and which could further reduce habitat suitability for fin specialists. All right, we're moving along. There's a lot of habitats. So this next habitat is the Eastern North American temperate freshwater marsh, wet meadow, and shrubland. Similar type of system to fens and bogs in terms of them being wetland type systems, but these are much more reliant on the precipitation for their water balances. So the key climate stressors we focused on for these systems were flooding and drought. We have the Eastern North American freshwater marsh, and then the Midwest wet prairie, wet meadow, and shrub swamp habitat. Flooding, we expect to alter soil and nutrient dynamics as drought cycles likely become more frequent. Soils will shift between wet and dry states, which can have large implications for decomposition rates, nitrogen cycling, and as well as plant nutrient uptake. Flooding also can provide larger inputs of runoff from surrounding areas, and considering a lot of these habitats exist in an agricultural matrix, that can result in nutrient inputs and eutrophication, which could further facilitate invasion. Flooding could also, granted, I think it's important to say that like flooding is a natural disturbance in these systems, but it's really thinking about the return interval for flooding. So how frequently flooding is happening, maybe the magnitude of flooding as well. And that's what can be transitioning these states away from their normal relationship to flooding. So more frequent and prolonged flooding can displace dominant species. It can compress vegetation zones, which tend to exist on a gradient from submerged to fully upland, and it can accelerate compositional turnover between these species. And then generally the loss of hydrologic specialists that exist in really narrowly defined moisture conditions can lead to a homogenization of the plant assemblages. Then related to that, flood tolerant species are more likely to increase given flooding conditions, which similar to drought and I talked about for other habitats, generally the species we can assume that species that are tolerant to these stressors will gain an advantage. Also, I mentioned in terms of nutrient input, eutrophication, flooding may increase invasive species pressure, particularly for some of the like really key invasive species in the Midwest, thinking about reed canary grass, common reed, cattails, etc. On the other hand, drought will play also an important role in these systems as the other side of the flood drought cycle. So drought can eliminate open water and dry soils and creating either seasonal, which is typical for some of the wetland systems that exist on the western margin of this of the Midwest, or even long-term habitat contraction. So as flood drought cycles accelerate, they shorten hydro periods. So plant response to hydro periods will also likely need to be accelerated which can disrupt successional patterns in all but some of the wettest systems. Drawdowns also expose sediments and can allow rapid colonization by annuals and rhizomatous plants, including invasive species, which can cause long-term shifts in community composition if disturbance does not disrupt their growing dominance. Also, lower waters can promote meadow and shrub expansion into formerly wetland areas. Let's see how we doing on time. Okay, we're okay. Let's see. This is the fifth chapter. We only have three more. Central and Eastern North American grassland and shrublands. These are your tallgrass prairies, whether that's the northern tallgrass prairie, which is mostly found in Minnesota, or the central tallgrass prairie, which is found really throughout the Midwest, as well as some more niche habitats like the central interior acidic open glade and barrens habitat found in Missouri and a little bit in Michigan. And then we have this this is the black sheep of the report. This is the Eastern North American ruderal meadow and shrubland. So really thinking about heavily invaded habitats. So the framing for that one is a little different. It's thinking about how climate change will either facilitate change back to a more natural state or continue to entrench invasive dominance there. So for the key climate stressors for this habitat group, we have drought, as well as thinking about seasonal shifts, mild winters, really the timing of spring, the length of the growing season, etc. For these grassland and shrubland systems, we expect that drought will likely intensify physiological stress in these systems and result in lower rates of productivity for system-wide. Also, generally, habitat models project fairly broad scale landscape transitions in the Midwest. So climate change is expected to promote prairie and savanna expansion into areas currently dominated by forest, really at the western edge of the grassland forest ecotype. So we're thinking a lot of places in Minnesota and Iowa, whereas wetter conditions in the eastern Midwest may continue to facilitate conversion of grasslands into forest and shrubland to continue to lead to woody encroachment in these systems, which are very fire dependent and currently lack fire. Drought may also result in shifts in dominant species, so favoring tolerant grasses like little bluestem, potentially driving shifts in the abundance of C4 versus C3 photosynthesis type plants, which that difference can have a strong implication for drought tolerance. And then drought isn't typically thought of as being a facilitator of encroachment, but it can facilitate shrub encroachment. So it can favor species like buckthorn and roughleaf dogwood, which are able to access deeper water reserves. And whereas drought may not help facilitate encroachment from more mesic species that aren't typically drought tolerant. For ruderal systems, we don't expect drought to reduce invasive species dominance in these systems. And in fact, drought may hinder restoration efforts, focusing on increasing the abundance of native species in these areas. Seasonal shifts here really, the impact is really driven through species changes in phenology. So longer growing seasons can boost productivity, but for species that are responding quickly, it can also increase vulnerability to late frosts. There is evidence out there that species that are able to respond their life cycle more quickly to environmental cues like earlier springs gain access to resources before other species, which can shift the competitive relationship between species and really provide an advantage to those. So some of the species that are most responsive in the absence of some of this frost stress I just mentioned, may become more abundant because of that advantage. Interestingly, these seasonal shifts also will result in novel competitive interactions, including earlier springs. Shifting seasonal timing can really influence the co-flowering timing of plants. So more species are likely to be flowering at the same time at the beginning and end of the growing season, and there's evidence that fewer species are flowering at the same time in the middle of the growing season, and that can increase competition for pollinators, and also may disrupt some of the synchrony between pollinators that have very specific plants that they visit. Also, seasonal shifts might increase woody and invasive advantage. Woody species tend to be relatively responsive to environmental cues, and the same is true for early active invasive grasses like smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass, which may gain priority access to some of those resources. Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I think I want to get to the main takeaways. But here we're looking at the central interior oak forest, woodland, and savanna. These 5 habitat types, and the climate stressors are drought and fire. With drought, we can expect a xeric, a dry shift in the understory. So rising drought intensity can favor drought-tolerant warm season grasses like big blue stem, and then conversely may negatively impact mesic species like maples, which may become less abundant in this landscape. Oaks and hickories are likely to receive an advantage from drought conditions because they tend to be more drought tolerant, but evidence out there shows that even severe or repeated drought can really negate this advantage, causing oak regeneration and mortality, especially in red oak species. Drought can also facilitate shrubland expansion into these systems, which are very similar to the grassland systems, really just kind of the next level in the kind of the transition from grassland to close forests. Fire is a really important component of savanna systems. Really, fire is necessary to maintain this partial canopy structure. So more frequent surface fires can favor fire-adapted species and may help to keep these systems more open, so maintain savanna systems across the Midwest. But really it matters the severity and frequency of fire. It really matters. Low to moderate fire severity can be beneficial for herbaceous diversity and grass dominance, whereas severe and very frequent fire can kill tree saplings and really push these systems towards open grassland states. Also, some flammable invasive grasses can really change the fire regime in the area. For example, like Kogan grass and smooth brome, increase fire frequency and intensity. They spread fire much more, and this can lead to a positive feedback where these invasive species promote more fire, further suppressing tree growth. Okay, last one. The northern forest, the Laurentian Acadian northern hardwood conifer forest. Here we're thinking about warming and mild winters. This is a system where really thinking about rain shifts is important, considering these in the context of the Midwest, where they are found at really the southern margin of their broader territorial extent. So warming is expected to drive a northward shift of the boreal temperate forest boundary, including a northward shift of a lot of those more boreal associated species. In the drier parts of the Midwest, like Minnesota, warming may actually limit hardwood arrival into these systems and promote more grassland states. Generally, heat stress for these systems, which typically don't experience a lot of heat stress, will lead to thermophilization, so communities that are more tolerant of heat and actually do better in high heat environments compared to those which are much more advantaged by cold conditions. And also, I think an interesting one here is the interaction between warming and invasive earthworms, where invasive earthworms have a very large ecological impact in these systems as they decompose otherwise slowly decomposing forest litter. And invasive warming may actually facilitate and increase the range of earthworm populations, which can then act on these systems by changing nutrient cycling. Lastly, we have mild winters. We talked about some of the implications for reducing snow cover, and that includes regeneration issues for some trees and frost risk, phenology and competitive shifts, same as we talked about for just a second ago for grasslands, where species that are able to respond more quickly or really more appropriately to these conditions may have an advantage, and that tends to not be the boreal species. That tends to be the more temperate type species. And then really critically for these far northern habitats is the extent to which mild winters can reduce overwinter mortality for key insect and pest species, which can have a pretty large impact on outbreak potential. So I got a bit of time left still, so I want to talk about some overarching lessons, some patterns that I've noticed in reading way too many papers, and some things that I will continue to chew on for a long time in terms of climate impacts to this broad swath of habitat type. The first is thinking about how climate change is likely going to create more dynamic and unstable habitats. So the frequency of disturbance is likely going to increase, which will likely increase the dynamicism of these habitats. So thinking about, I mentioned that for some of the floodplain forests, where as flooding becomes more frequent, that can include more rapid changes in physical habitat structure as flooding causes more erosion and sediment deposition in other areas, and also thinking about the climate disturbances that are influenced by climate change, driving patterns of mortality, driving succession, and accelerating a lot of those processes. So really, I think a key takeaway is that climate change is actually it's going to just as a stressor on these environments, it's really going to rattle them in a way. And I think in relation to that, there's a lot of evidence that opportunistic, generalist, and early successional species are likely going to be broadly considered climate winners. This next one I mentioned for a lot of these habitats, and I think it's true for all of them, particularly for forest-related habitats, is how climate stressors are going to disproportionately impact plant regeneration. That's because young plants tend to be the most sensitive. So future community composition will be strongly influenced by the species that are most capable of regenerating in these habitats. In some instances, where for habitats, it may be that the current assemblages are unable to adequately replace themselves. And then in other instances, species which we anticipate to do better under future climate conditions may be unable to establish, potentially prolonging poorly adapted community assemblages. For example, if ash trees seem to be trees that are going to do particularly well because of drought or mild winters in Northeast mesic forests, that's a problem, considering we know that emerald ash borer is going to continue to likely decimate ash tree populations around the region. Also, a really critical driver of change in these systems is deer herbivory, when deer populations are likely going to increase in winter as they have more access to forage during the winter as snow cover declines. And what deer do is if given enough options, they will preferentially browse certain species and leave other species. And that's in the trees in the saplings that deer will preferentially browse are not necessarily the same ones that are going to do well with climate change. So this can have a strong and opposing force on the future of these forests and climate adaptation efforts. Mesification is another, I think, broad topic, which I think is interesting for a lot of these more eastern forest habitats. Mesification is this process where these historically fire-adapted systems have shifted to dominance of some more of the shade-tolerant, moisture-loving species like maples. And then fire suppression in these areas further increases the ability of these species to dominate, which they then shade the understory. They create cooler, wetter conditions, and this is a process that is continuing in the Midwest. We see increasing rates of mesification, but in terms of thinking about the future of these systems, as drought increases, as fire probability increases, there's a lot of concern out there that there is some threshold at which these systems actually are going to be more influenced by drying and fire conditions than they are by these trends towards mesification. So in that instance, I think it's interesting to think about how these systems are still currently driven towards future compositions which are not really going to be suitable for future climate conditions. Let's see, I'm running out of time. This is a review of some compositional. I'm going to talk about invasive species. Generally, invasive species are expected to thrive under changing climate conditions, such you think about warmer winters, rising temperatures, and more frequent droughts can create space for ecological space for these invasive species to establish, including disturbance, creating that type of space for them. Also, we talked a little bit about range expansion for species, so like kudzu, Japanese barberry. So we expect that climate change will likely facilitate novel species movement into the Midwest, as well as amplifying the potential spread of species already here. And that's not true for all species. Climate change will negatively impact certain species. I get more into that in the report, but I think the broad trend is that it's likely going to amplify that pressure. And the same really goes for thinking about pest and disease pressure. As disturbance, as these climate stressors stress trees and other plant species, they become less capable of defending themselves against these threats. And then we have the expansion of bark beetles and spongy moths, et cetera, into the region, including thinking about the southern pine beetle is anticipated to move northward into the Midwest region. So that's a future thing to look forward to. I was going to close. I really didn't leave any time for questions. Sorry about that. I think it's important to consider as we talk about this. Like there's so many caveats to what I've said. There's so many. It's very difficult to think about how, on the one hand, drought's going to impact a habitat, and then flooding is going to impact a habitat, and what the net effect is going to be. So there's a lot of unknowns. But I think when we really focus on some of these specific stressors, we have enough information to do adaptation management, planning, and conservation actions that can really focus on what we think is most likely going to happen in these systems. So, oh, huh, why am I hearing myself?
I think your audio cut out for a second there, Hugh.
That was weird.
Okay.
I was hearing myself, but I must have recorded on the slide or something when I was practicing. Anyways, thank you for your time. I also want to acknowledge a lot of the folks who helped me out on this: Olivia Ledee, Marta Lyons, Taylor Siddons, Catherine Charton, and a lot of the other partners for the Midwest CASC, including the states and whatnot. So thanks everyone for their time. I'll stop sharing. We can do some questions. I know
Yeah,
we're at one. I'm happy to take questions for a little bit of time if people want to stick on.
that would be great. Yeah, if anybody has a burning question and you're available to stay for a couple minutes, please feel free to ask directly or pop it in the chat.
Yeah, it sounds like we have a question from Annika. If you're willing to stick on, Hugh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Where do you start your research for reports like this? If someone wanted to do this on a regional scale, do you have tips for how to start?
Yeah, well, part, as I kind of talked about in the beginning, part of the process was about thinking about how to subdivide into identifiable habitats, thinking about specific regions. One of the things that was really helpful with the USNBC dataset is how they identify key dominant species for each habitat. And really that became the focus of my literature search. I didn't do a comprehensive literature search because in like the really structured way, because I didn't think that that was really going to help me uncover a lot of the more indirect impacts of climate change that I think would probably get screened out in a traditional one. So it's a big lift. But yeah, Annika, if you're feel free to email me if you have questions if you're going to do something similar.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we'll put you two in touch via email. And then we have a question, a raised hand from Sadie.
Hi, thank you. Um, so Hugh, first of all, this is phenomenal. Thank you so much for putting all this together. I have already clicked on all the links and bookmarked them. Um, I live in the Driftless area, and in addition, to working within natural resources, do a lot of volunteer work with local organizations, one of which works with private landowners and
Mhm.
doing conservation work. There's like their drive to do it is for the habitat, right? And so I was thinking about how do we bring this information to them to help with the planning, because in our, giant bluff valleys that we have, one side is savanna, the other side is tallgrass prairie. So we've got like
Mhm.
the oak and everything, but then also on top of the bluff, you generally have agriculture or grazing, same thing in the valley. So like everything is very segmented. And so it feels like maybe the best thing we can help do is like be more strategic in recommendations for restoration, especially in those spaces that could maybe go either way. Is there a way for us to take what you've already done and figure out how to incorporate that, or is that maybe a next project to figure out how to put this stuff into like smaller community size planning?
Yeah, I think that's generally the next step is to think about this as a very large set of information, which is just kind of like reviewing where we're at in terms of how we think about these issues. I think for like your example, that system is really at like ground zero for um, habitat change because of climate change. You know, that ecotone boundary right there. So I think like in terms of if you were going to manage something like that, do people want it to stay as a savanna? Do they want it to stay as a grassland? What are some like, are they really concerned about bur oak? And I think in terms of identifying like what would be the best thing to do, you can hopefully look at this report and see like, oh, okay, we have bur oak is going to be really stressed by I don't know by extreme drought or it really needs more fire to compete. I I can't be very prescriptive, but I think like it could be helpful for just like starting the conversation about like what might tip the scale further towards a certain system state.
Awesome. Thank you, Hugh. How about one last question if you're up for it?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, great. In many areas of eastern US, timber harvesting is the predominant disturbance agent. With this in mind, how do you scale or how do we scale modest increases in other forest disturbance due to climate change? This is a question of what amount of disturbance, so logging, background, natural, climate driven, will be additive, climate change, climate combined with background versus compensatory.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's the big question is really, what is, and that's the big unknown in climate research in a lot of ways is how a lot of these interacting stressors synergize or don't. And I think, you know, let's see how we scale. That's yeah. I mean, frankly, we just need more studies. And I mean, timber management, timber harvesting is forestry and can be incorporated into adaptation planning as well. Um, yeah, I'm not sure if I really answered your question, Andrew, but I think that's a tough one.
Yeah, just to jump in, this is Andy Whitman. I'm with the Maine Forest Service, but um, I've worked as much in natural systems and managed systems, and so I often come to climate change and forestry thing, thinking through like how is the natural aspect of this all going to change, and then I just have to sort of step back and remember, like humans are doing a lot of stuff that could compensate for climate change, or could just actually just make it much worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to understand how does harvesting work, and obviously it could go either way. One could imagine conceptually, harvesting that makes it worse, harvesting makes it better. And then there's just sort of like what's more likely to happen just in terms of what we know about human behavior looking backwards. But sometimes I find myself thinking I'm overthinking climate change when human behavior may be in certain systems a more important factor.
Right. Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I think like in the context of a lot of these grassland savanna systems, which are either disappearing or much less frequent on the Midwest landscape because of human alterations and fire regimes, really any change in how we do fire management would have a much larger impact than likely than climate change up to a certain point, probably. So yeah, that's a very good point. It's I think there's ways also of thinking like I think we silo climate change a lot in terms of how we think about impacts to habitats and species, but really it's not anything new. It's an intensification of some impacts that already are affecting these habitats, and maybe a lessening of others like winter severity. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The human footprint plays a big role, and that's one I didn't really touch on. That's a big one.
All right. Well, thank you, Hugh, for a great presentation. Thanks for everybody who's stuck around with us a little bit longer for some questions. We'll be sharing out the recording of this seminar in a couple of days, and I'll include Hugh's email there if you have anything you'd like to connect with him directly on. For anybody who's still on and willing to take a quick poll before you hop off, we would appreciate that. Lets us know how we did today and how we can do better in the future. But with that, I will say another thank you and goodbye, and enjoy the rest of your Mondays. We'll see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.